I have been thrown into an interesting, albeit frustrating, position of hearing people I used to watch increasingly split into two camps. The 2000s atheistic movement split into the pro-woke and the anti-woke. This specific essay will deal with genetically modified skeptics, aka Drew's, recent video. Is wokeness a religion? A model of woke religion explained, but only in as much as I want to address the broader scope through it, not so much to react specifically to it. So for context, you can watch it first, but I wouldn't say that it's necessary. This is a philosophical breakdown of the reasoning of the left as it appears to the right, or me. To set the fundamental issue I want to address, I'll just say this. The typical approach of Drew and the crew is that if it goes against the science or utilitarian ethics, he attacks it from the point of view of empiricism, or utilitarian ethics. The core of the anti-woke argumentation, though, is that it just doesn't work. What then do the principles of utilitarianism mean to me if they lead to my country falling or destroying itself? Now this, I would assume, would be a whole debate, because he wouldn't agree they don't work. I would imagine the counter would be, well, it's true that England, now taking as an example, is having a larger and larger percentage of non-English people in England. But this is only a problem if you think English people and non-English people are somehow different. It's all just people after all, so as long as they obey the law, it shouldn't be a problem, unless you're racist. It's not a bad point from his point of view, and it's one the reader should hold in mind because I'll circle back to it. It's a long video, so when I first opened it, I noticed a chapter with philosophy in it, hoping, for the first time in a while, that he will actually try to dig a bit deeper into the reasoning behind the anti-woke. I was duly disappointed. Instead of actually trying to reconstruct the system of thought of the opposition and completely letting go of his liberal worldview for the moment, he just goes into debunking mode. The way he does this is by sociologizing things, by trying to construct interpretations of facts, in this case specific behaviors. This, as it so happens, is a major mistake. This particular instance, he mentions Simon Magis. He talks of how the apostles labeled him as a sorcerer instead of simply an early theologian, because the apostles saw him as an ancient day grifter who tried to buy his way into being an apostle, basically. He's generally considered to be a founder of Gnosticism, and due to this he had some theological clashes with Peter, unsurprisingly. The specifics, though, don't really matter for the point I'm trying to make, because they don't matter for him either. Because for Drew, the difference between sorcery and theology is just a linguistic and rhetorical difference, not an actual difference. And yes, from a sociological point of view, from a point of view of somebody just looking at the behaviors, perhaps, or just the outside appearances to what they're doing and saying, this rings true. It rings true for somebody on the outside looking in, but it's not true for their system of thought. That's the whole bloody point. This is the very reason they themselves made that very distinction. You would not have made it. They did. Why did they make it? You cannot answer this if you don't see their philosophy, no matter how stupid it might appear to you or how unfunctional it is in reality. His explanation of the why basically says that it's a political and a rhetorical tool to discredit Simon. This is something which often comes up because from a purely outside, objective perspective, you don't get to understand the actual system of thought behind their actions. The problem is that they made that distinction because they genuinely thought he was a lousy theologian, or just a grifter who would try to exploit their system for money, or would try to subvert their religion, or whatever other reason. There was genuine reasoning behind this distinction. I will say that a caveat is needed. Some distinctions genuinely are made due to purely rhetorical or political reasons and only for practical purposes, and the people who do that actually don't believe in them. Let's assume that at least some people who died for their beliefs actually believed in them. I don't think that's a stretch. Yet you will catch Drew and similar YouTubers always explaining things in this sort of way, implying, knowingly or not, that they don't actually really believe them, or that it doesn't matter. It's a rhetorical device and nothing more for them. This, I think, is disingenuous. Later he makes the following argument. Before the Enlightenment, what I didn't like was sorcery, what I did like was religion. After the Enlightenment, what I didn't like was religion, what I did like was philosophy and science. Insinuating here that it is but a mere rhetorical point to distinguish what I like from what I don't like. Now, it's kind of true, there is always going to be some rhetorics differentiating the two. But barring grifters, as we said, and assuming apostles aren't grifters, the reasoning becomes important. If it matters in their worldview, it's not mere rhetorics. The distinctions which they make matter. I don't think a physicist today would be particularly happy if you said that physics is basically the same as astrology. Now yes, the practical applications of physics are important and tangible, sure, but at the end of the day it is a particular philosophy. A very well thought out philosophy, but a philosophy nonetheless. A philosophy which starts with some unprovable axioms in its thought. In this philosophy, the distinction of science and pseudoscience is quite important. Pseudosciences are often called religions because it's not based on philosophical systems which made the sciences, but on philosophical systems which produce, so to say, nothing and have no testable explanations. With that in mind, now enter this. Quote, distinguishing between one science and another's religion, he says, serves to put a stigmatizing label on a person or idea in order to conclude that it's bad, dumb, or irrational. End quote. Well, yes. When did the people I used to watch start thinking that distinguishing between good ideas and bad ideas is a bad thing? What exactly has happened? In a similar manner, he earlier says that the Enlightenment thinkers used to distinguish between good ideas and bad ideas by labeling things as sciences and philosophies opposed to religions. But don't you forget, he goes on, that the medicine of the post-Enlightenment era was just as wacky as before the Enlightenment, here implying that this distinguishing between good ideas and bad ideas is a rhetorical device which shouldn't be used because it labels and stigmatizes people and their ideas, completely forgetting meanwhile that, while yes, some ideas in early medicine were clearly silly, it is by constant distinguishing of the best ideas among a bad group of ideas we manage to claw our way to our current understanding of science. Funny that, stigmatizing and labeling bad ideas actually led to results. Who would have thought? Not only that, but this is actually a core tenet of science. This is an extension to what I said earlier of physics. It is intensely important for a physicist to differentiate between science and pseudoscience, because the very thing which he prides himself on the most, the unquestionable practicality of science which ensures him of the truth of his philosophy, is only ensured by this distinction giving credence to his claims. By very standards of physics, that of predictable power, physics succeeds. The referential point of physics is completely in the outside world and is testable. This isn't surprising considering that empiricism essentially is a philosophy which is completely based on that which is outside of the mind. This is why science is so practical. If you want to attack what physics has concluded, you must attack it from within the philosophy of physics itself. You can attack it from a different philosophical perspective, but then the physicist will simply tell you that his philosophy leads to tangible results, and this is what matters to him. Ergo, he does not care about your alternate philosophy. He succeeds by his own rules, and by the standards which matter to him the most. A physicist doesn't need to care is because his testing point is outside, and can be defined quite clearly. Morality is out of the equation on the questions of why the rocks fall. It is a purely results-oriented endeavor. This was said several times through history, most notably though when Newton first took an instrumentalist approach to physics, saying that by describing the effects of gravity, he has described what gravity is. What it is, in the sense of the moral question what a human is completely irrelevant to physics. Now compare that to what we said earlier of anthropologists and sociologists assuming a specific human nature. I'll focus on sociology because it's what I know best. They will follow what appears to be a scientific process, because in large parts it is, yet there is a contradiction in large aspects of it. A physicist will look at the goal of sociology to research societies and think it is possible in theory, but in practice it will be incredibly difficult due to the impossibility of controlling variables with experiments. This is a damning argument in its own right, but not one I'm making, and not one which explains the woke reasoning. Newton, as I said, excluded the nature of aspect of reasoning in physics, yet that cannot be excluded in sociology. In whichever theory you explain an aspect of society, you are assuming a particular human nature. For instance, Marx wrote a lot on the subject of philosophical anthropology. Even though he never gave a specific definition, one can be inferred from his writings and there is a lot of debate on it. The problem of this lies in the science part, where this nature of is supposed to be excluded and irrelevant. Yet, it becomes very relevant when you start thinking about phenomena within a society. How you interpret it matters, because it implies a specific human nature, which further implies how society should be structured. All this, combined with these grand sociological theories like Marxism or feminism being unfalsifiable, means that you're essentially just picking a favorite based on your moral preferences and justifying it scientifically, quote unquote, which, I would say unsurprisingly, leads to completely unfruitful discussions within these circles, and discussions which, might I add, due to such theories being unfalsifiable, strangely resemble a God of the Gaps argument, leading to accusations of religiosity. Now, allow me to circle back to the statement I said earlier. I said that it's apparent that policies and the results of woke reasoning lead to terrible results on the ground, and that he would likely disagree with me here. The failure of his system of thought comes because the referential point has been switched from reality, the outside world, what we classically mean by falsifiability of science, to a specific view of what a human is, to a specific philosophical anthropology. In a similar manner in which Deadpool movies don't take the in-movie reality seriously, so they constantly subvert it with fourth wall breaks, the woke reasoning goes meta by not actually engaging in arguments, but it must find a solution to a problem within the philosophical anthropology which they are convinced is the only mortal one because it's been subtly built into this new quote-unquote science. The reason this happens is because you cannot define a society without at the same time defining what a good society is, meaning you're also defining what policies this good society ought to hold. As I said, there is no empirical evidence which will make a Marxist say that, in fact, it seems that Marxistic theories don't work, and for much of a similar reason, Drew doesn't see the point of the right, because at no time does he consider that his very axioms are wrong and there is no empirical way to disprove what he says. All arguments of the right will be explained not by engaging and seeing their point, but by going outside of them, by sociologizing them, by explaining why it's happening and why it is only rhetorics or grifting. The right does not have the same philosophical anthropology, which means they are contradicting the very science by which the woke justify their reasoning. Just like I mentioned with Simon Magis, for the apostles, the distinction between theology and sorcery was meaningful, because it was meaningful within their system. Drew and I probably both have way more appreciation for scientific systems, so to us, this theological distinction looks meaningless. Yet, if I were to judge their labeling of Simon as a sorcerer, I must do it by their standards, not my own, especially to judge if it was honest or not. Their standard wasn't practicality in the scientific sense, it was something else entirely. Yet, for Drew, it was mere power grabbing in order so they can continue being racist or sexist or whatever. I hope you're starting to see the ridiculousness of such a position. Even for science, he claims that the distinction which the scientific systems make are meaningless and mere rhetorics. The reason he does this is because sociology, which I'd say essentially developed the reasoning which the woke uses, has an inherent flaw within its thinking. It mixes morality and objective fact, which leads into so-called sciences which have a specific morality built into them. So whenever he sociologizes such debates as those of the apostles and Simon, he isn't actually concerned with the arguments which they presented, seen by the fact he does not mention them. He's just concerned with judging them by his own moral standards which are embedded in the theories he interprets these discussions through. Ironically enough, the very standards which he's appealing to as to why he's correct go against the very philosophy of science. In that, he himself here has said, the very distinguishing in the early medicine between science and religion or pseudoscience was a bad thing, because it was mere labeling or discriminating. That same labeling or discriminating led to medicine as we know it today, or to physics as we know it today. Distinguishing the best ideas out of a group of bad ideas and doing it constantly is what makes science. To paraphrase King Crocoduck, hate the process for being so rigorous and discriminatory, hate the people for labeling cretins, but don't doubt the effectiveness. Yet, they will present themselves as the side of science and reason. I'm not attacking Drew here specifically, mind you. I'm saying that if you listen carefully, you'll hear this sort of thing always embedded into the reasoning of the woke. This is why, it seems to Drew, the woke is backed up by science. It is, only in that it is backed up by what every other STEM scientist would classify as, a corrupt science. A science with a specific morality embedded. The referential point has been subtly shifted from the outside world to a specific view of what a human is, which necessarily implies how society of humans ought to behave. Sociology does not fail by its own standards, perhaps, but those are standards which, if you don't agree with them morally, you just don't care about their conclusions, no matter how backed up by science they are. So when I said at the beginning of this essay that Drew and I would disagree on England working or not, why should be apparent by now. We couldn't even have a conversation about it. And we couldn't have a conversation about it because he presupposes what constitutes a society working within his thinking and then hides behind his corrupted science instead of actually discussing what it means to be a society and for a society to work. This is something which, day by day, is being noticed by more and more people throughout the West. The reason, as I have laid it out here, is that sociological thinking which he employs does not care about anyone's standards but their own, and they cannot have a conversation about those standards because to have a conversation in good faith about those standards means to potentially admit that the side which to them is racist might have a point and a developed philosophical system which could actually work. Such a conversation is a philosophical conversation where sociologisms could not be used, and where a view of what a society should be needs to be defended through moral grounds, not scientific ones. Such a conversation would lead to them admitting to preposterous claims as to what a society ought to be, and claims with which rare few people in the wider audience would agree with. It is easier and safer to simply sociologize what they are saying and to try and bury the opposition under this corrupted science. It's fine that sociology succeeds by its own standards, obviously, but unlike physics, which says, I don't care about your alternate philosophies, I just launched a bloody satellite into orbit, the only thing which sociology can say is, I don't care about your alternate philosophies, every other form of organizing a society is racist or sexist, even though racism and sexism are defined in new ways, and even though the results of such policies are interesting. So, on to the problem which I have laid out at the beginning of this essay. Is it a problem that England is becoming more and more non-English? For this worldview, it cannot be. There are two sides of this coin, the moral and the scientific side. First, they will make a moral claim, which will be morality of rules-based utilitarianism, which, if you disagree with it, and there's plenty of good reasons to disagree with it, your disagreement will be attacked not from a philosophical standpoint, but from the so-called scientific standpoint, essentially ending all actual debate. Now, due to length considerations, I'm not going to go into a critique of utilitarianism here. Is it a problem? Well, if all humans are tabula rasa, all humans are completely equal on everything, so heritage doesn't matter. Ergo, you cannot say it is a problem if England is becoming non-English, as that would disagree with the tabula rasa of utilitarian ethics. Secondly, if you come at it from any other philosophical standpoint, you are necessarily a racist because on all scientific grounds the non-English in England are exactly the same as the English. And also on scientific grounds, every discrimination of the non-English in any sort of a way is nothing more but rhetorics which racists use to get into power, just like we've seen all the way from Simon Magis. Ergo, any sort of separation towards them means you're racist, and this is backed up by science. Even though the theory through which the scientific research was conducted presupposes that they're equal. This, though, is irrelevant. If you haven't noticed, it's essentially begging the question. Also worth noting that any other type of morality would see England being non-English as a massive problem. That England is becoming non-English or non-Anglo-Saxon, because I am talking of ethnicity here and I use this term, is not a problem, because ethnicity doesn't matter by their theories. Ethnicity is inherently discriminatory, and you shouldn't complain that England isn't primarily English because all humans are equal. Yet, if your philosophy might suggest to you that this actually matters, the corrupted science comes in telling you that you're wrong objectively and scientifically, as if you could be scientifically wrong about morality. If you have an obvious question about the correlation of crimes and immigrants, you're a racist, because through a Marxistic interpretation of data, this is wrong scientifically, even though a Marxistic view presupposes that it has nothing to do with heritage and culture, but only with economics. I say, which plenty of people have said one way or another, I do not subscribe to your morality, and through my morality this is a problem. I reject your definition of racism, and I reject your entire corrupted science due to the reasons I've listed. Drew and others likely could not even engage in such a conversation. This is why, even though the pendulum has been shifting, the left still can do nothing but scream about racism. This is the most important referential point in their worldview. And when democratically other people say that they don't want that to be the referential point, that they have a different kind of morality, that they don't like where this entire thought process is going, and that they see some pretty basic human instincts as not inherently stupid and non-scientific, they are stupid, uneducated bigots who just want to perpetuate their racist power. If racism means keeping my country the way it's been for a few thousand years,